Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Subscriber Participating Transmission Owner Model meeting to discuss the final proposal and draft tariff language. My name is Caitlin McGee. I'm representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting. I'm also joined by Deb Levine, Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management. As a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting can be found on the Policy Initiatives webpage. This is under the Stay Informed tab of the California ISO's website. Next slide, please. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. However, we ask that you please keep comments professional and respectful and try to refrain from repeating anything that has already been said. Next slide, please. If you want to make a comment or ask a question today, there's a few ways to do that. If you're connected to audio using your computer or through the Call Me option, you can click the raise hand icon, which is in the bottom right toolbar. If you are connected through audio only, you may click #2 and that'll add you to the queue. And if you'd like, you could send your question or comment into the chat and I will read it aloud for you. When making your comment or question, please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. If you need any technical assistance today during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer and they'll help you out. Next slide. So here's a quick overview of the policy initiative stakeholder process here at the ISO. As you can see, we're towards the end of the proposal development piece of this process. We've gone through the straw proposal, the draft final proposal, various iterations of this paper. And so today we'll be talking about the final proposal, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll hand it over to Deb. She'll walk us through the agenda today and some of the topics that she'll be walking us through.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and recap the topics in the final proposal for the subscriber PTO model. And it's the development of the model, the use of encumbrances. Underneath transmission costs, we've got the subscriber wheeling charge, the future network upgrades, and termination of subscriber encumbrances, the transmission cost allocation, and then the generator interconnection process, the transmission planning process, and deliverability. Next slide, please. So with respect to comments that we received from the revised draft final proposal, in essence, there were just 4 clarifications that were requested, which is what was included in the final proposal. And stakeholders were looking for additional detail on the study process, exactly how is that going to work with respect to the TPP and the generator interconnection process. What's the detail as far as getting deliverability for the projects that are coming in on the subscriber PTO line? What projects would this model apply to? So we went ahead and clarified that. I had thought that having that in the original definition was sufficient, but I'm glad that people asked the question so that we could make sure that everybody's aware of exactly what types of models, transmission generation combined models will apply to the SPTO model. And then just a clarification on CRR opportunities as far as the subscriber PTO model is concerned. In that instance, the ISO did change what I would say is significantly, having run market services from 2005 to 2009, the way we did CRRs back in those days, they were CRRs, they weren't FTRs. We were already past the FTR stage. but the cost allocation on the CRRs did change substantially in 2015. So that we'll go through that as part of the clarification. So with that, let's start with the first slide. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that the proposal has evolved since it was introduced last August. In August, you may recall that we had intended originally to just incorporate the structure of a subscriber PTO into the transmission control agreement and make very little changes in the ISO tariff. With your help as stakeholders, the proposal has evolved over time. Various questions went ahead and outlined to us areas that we hadn't even thought about needed to be addressed. And so it has changed over time. But we do have significant support for the development of a subscriber PTO model. And the model, in essence, will allow project developers to join the ISO using both the FERC subscriber-funded transmission approach and, to the extent possible, allows for out-of-state resources to be within the ISO BA. And this is one of the clarifications we made in the proposal itself. When we say out-of-state resources, we're in reference to how the California Public Utilities Commission refers to resources in their portfolio. So out-of-state, quote-unquote, means outside of the ISO balancing authority area from a functional perspective. But the CPUC does call it in their portfolios when you're trying to match up what's in their portfolios versus what the ISO is adding into the transmission grid. It is really just means outside of the ISO balancing authority area. And that gets to what projects are able to use the SPTO model. It'll be any project that is outside of the ISO balancing authority area that would be able to use this model to the extent that they wanted to bring a transmission line with generation into the ISO BA. It allows load-serving entities to meet the renewable portfolio standards and other state procurement requirements without increasing the transmission revenue requirement. And again, this is another clarification over time, without increasing the transmission revenue requirement associated with the building of the subscriber PTO transmission line. It does not, it will increase the transmission revenue requirement to the extent that the existing PTOs need to upgrade their system, and that upgrade is not already part of, well, even if the upgrade is part of the transmission planning process or part of the generator interconnection process, it's still going to increase any existing participating transmission owners' transmission revenue requirement that will flow into the access charge. So that's how it has, the development of the model has evolved over time. Does anybody have any questions before I go into each one of the elements of the proposal? I don't see.
Looks like we have any questions.
Yeah, I don't see any raised hands. So, all right, next slide, please. So with respect to using the ISO's existing functionality for encumbrances, we did not receive additional feedback on this element in the revised draft final proposal. So the functionality is going to remain the same, where the subscriber rights will have the encumbrance functionality already defined in the tariff. So it'll get, the subscriber will get the scheduling priority on the subscriber PTO transmission facilities, and they'll be exempted from, obviously, the transmission service charge because they've already paid for that separately on the subscriber PTO facilities. they won't get congestion costs on the subscriber PTO facilities, big cost recovery offsets, and the day-ahead market congestion allocation for the SPTO facilities. So any questions on encumbrances and how we're going to use that functionality? Okay, next slide, please. With respect to transmission costs, there are still concerns that were raised with respect to using the upgrades in existing PTO systems and including that cost in the ISOs, in the transmission revenue requirements for the TAC and the wheeling access charge. And the ISO, we understand the concerns that you have and the increased cost that could be associated with a subscriber PTO coming in. We really don't think we're going to have a whole lot of these because you need to be outside of the ISO balancing authority area and bringing generation and transmission to the ISO balancing authority area, thereby expanding it. And we think that there's too much FERC, okay, I'm losing my words. There's already too much FERC precedent as far as, you know, Section 24.15.2 requires existing PTOs to pay back the generator if they're upgrading the transmission system of an existing PTO. And then Section 24.10 requires existing PTOs to pay for affected system upgrades. And that's for generation that isn't even connecting within the ISO balancing authority area or serving ISO balancing authority area load. So we just really think there's so much precedent already there that it's not applicable for us to now require the generation that is part of the subscriber PTO model to pay for, in addition to paying for the transmission, the subscriber PTO transmission line, having to pay in addition for all of the costs associated with existing PTO upgrades that may be needed on the system to interconnect the subscriber PTO line. I'd also note that while, yes, the line was not approved through the transmission planning process, for lines that are approved, there's another section in 24, it's like 2430 or something, that requires the existing PTO to pay for all interconnection costs for a subscriber for a approved project sponsor line. And then one of the other stakeholders raised the point that we should be requiring the subscriber PTO to pay for the existing transmission facilities, any upgrades, similar to the proposal that is being discussed in the long-term firm transmission service. But the disconnect there is the long-term firm transmission service is for an entity outside of the ISO to, in essence, go ahead and transit the ISO's balancing authority area and export out of the ISO. So it's generation that's not in the ISO balancing authority area and not going to be used within the ISO balancing authority area. Whereas in the case of the subscriber PTO model, the generation is within the ISO balancing authority area. It's highly likely that the majority of the generation is going to be used for load serving entities within the ISO, which is why it's part of the CPUC portfolio. It's not, you know, maybe some of it is going to be exported, but certainly not, you know, the substantial portion of the line that's coming into the ISO. So that's where we ended up coming out on the transmission costs. So next slide, please. So again, we don't intend to change our proposal with respect to transmission costs from the revised draft final proposal. The subscriber PTO will develop a $1 per megawatt hour subscriber wheeling charge. And I would just note for this group, because you have been so heavily involved, when you start looking at the tariff language, to the extent you haven't done that yet, when the attorneys got a hold of where the whole package and the whole model ended up at, we went ahead and changed the term from subscriber wheeling charge to non-subscriber usage rate and non-subscriber usage payment is what the subscriber PTO will get. They thought that that better aligned with truly who's paying for it and what they're paying for. So it's the non-subscribers that are paying for the use of the line, the subscriber PTO line, because they did not previously pay for it. So just in case you haven't looked at the tariff yet, you'll see that change as part of what's in the tariff versus what's been in the all of the papers to date, so that people don't get confused. We do have the cap on the subscriber wheeling charge. It can be no greater than the TAC or the WAC, and the upgrade costs on existing PTO systems will be included in the transmission revenue requirement of the existing PTO. So with that, are there any additional questions or comments on the transmission costs associated with the subscriber PTO model?
Questions at this time?
Okay. And everybody remembers they can just go ahead and raise their hands or do the #2 like Caitlin mentioned in the beginning. Next slide, please. So with respect to the subscriber wheeling charge, most stakeholders supported charging non-subscriber use of the subscriber PTO facilities. Obviously, you know, FERC open access and cost causation support usage, support payment for usage to the extent that the entity is not a subscriber and did not pay for the line. And then one of the commenters commented, shouldn't the subscriber PTO just get CRRs instead of getting a subscriber wheeling charge? And the challenge there is twofold. One is that the CRRs are used to provide the congestion revenue to give the subscriber the perfect hedge. So we need to have the ability to use those CRRs, or what would have been CRRs, for the providing the perfect hedge. The second thing is that to the extent that the line is not fully subscribed, so in the case of Transwest Express, that is in the middle of the subscriber PTO process, they've only got subscribers from north to south. So in that instance, we will be allocating and auctioning CRRs from south to north. But in that instance, the way that the CRR process changed is that all of that revenue goes back to the CRR holder and or the balancing account. And then the balancing account is used on a monthly basis to the extent that the cost of congestion is greater than the amount of revenues that were received because of the money that's used to ensure the perfect hedge for any existing contract or transmission ownership right the ISO still has in its grid. So that's what's going on with CRRs. And then taking that one step further, the question wasn't asked specifically, but taking that one step further, what about providing the entity SPTO merchant transmission CRRs? And what ends up happening is the tariff only allows the entity either to receive merchant transmission CRRs or get some type of cost recovery. And to date, you know, I've been here 26 years, and nobody has agreed to just take merchant CRRs for the cost of a brand new transmission line, and it's never resulted in a brand new transmission line being built. So while, you know, the FERC structure provides for an entity to just accept congestion revenue rights for any merchant transmission, we've never had any merchant transmission built. So that's where we are headed with respect to the subscriber wheeling charge and why we're not going to use congestion revenue rights for that. So next slide, please. So in summary, the proposal is not changing from the revised draft proposal. The non-subscribers will be charged for use of the subscriber PTO line. The subscriber PTO, in essence, is going to pay either the TAC or the WAC. There's not going to be a separate charge per se, which is why the attorneys changed it around to a usage rate and then just a payment to the subscriber PTO. The cost to build the actual subscriber PTO transmission line and facilities will not be included in the TRR, but the cost associated with the any upgrades required by existing participating transmission owners will be included in the transmission revenue requirement. To the extent that the project is not fully subscribed, CRRs will be available through the existing tariff process. And if the subscribers in the day-ahead market or in real time do not use their rights, do not self-schedule their rights in the market, then that, those rights will be available for usage in the market, similar to any existing contract that the ISO has had in the market since, 1998 type thing, when we first started out. So that's where we've ended up on the subscriber wheeling charge. Any additional comments or questions on that element of the proposal? I know there's 56 people out there, so I know you're out there someplace. Okay, no
question, thank you.
Okay, not seeing any questions. Moving on to the next slide. Yep, there you go. Okay. So network upgrades beyond the original build. This is in essence when additional generators want to interconnect to the subscriber PTO transmission line. It's part of the ISO control grid once it energizes. And how are those costs going to be paid? In essence, there was no additional feedback received on this element of the proposal, and it's therefore not changing from the revised draft final proposal, whereby any new network upgrades will be recovered through the existing generator interconnection process, is where the generator upfront finances the upgrade, and then it's paid back. Once it achieves COD, it's paid back over 5 years, and the existing participating transmission owner, which will then include the subscriber PTO, will go ahead and recover those costs through the access charge. So the subscriber PTO would have to develop a separate cost of service rate for those new network upgrades that are required as part of either the generator interconnection process or actually as part of the transmission planning process. If there's something, an upgrade that's required as part of the transmission planning process, then they'd also have to do that at cost of service. And reimbursement for those would be consistent with the tariff. So any questions on the network upgrades beyond the original build? All right.
No questions in.
Not seeing any hands. If we could go on to the next slide. So termination of subscriber encumbrance. Again, we did not receive any additional feedback from the revised draft final proposal, so we're not changing it at this time. Stakeholders strongly support this position, and in essence, once the subscriber PTO has fully paid off the original build cost, which is going to be memorialized, once that's fully paid off, then whatever the applicable regulatory requirements are at that time, 30 or 40 years down the road. Do I still want to be alive or not? I'm not sure. Depends upon whether it's 30 or 40 years. But anyways, whatever exists that far down the road is what will be applicable for the subscriber encumbrances. And obviously, to the extent that the subscriber encumbrance contract allows for extensions of the encumbrance right on their line for the life of their line, then similar to any existing contract, that would be allowed as part of the original encumbrance of the subscriber PTO facilities. So with that, any questions on the termination of the subscriber encumbrance? All right, not seeing any hands again. We'll go on to the transmission cost allocation proposal. So next slide, please. So as we previously discussed, the subscriber wheeling charge itself, there is no change from the revised draft final proposal. The non-subscriber wheeling charge, as I have already discussed, with respect to the congestion revenue rights, there was one stakeholder that requested additional information as far as how CRRs would work. I think we've gone through that already. So we're not planning on changing the revised draft final proposal, and the non-subscriber will pay for use of the SPTO line. The revenue associated with the WAC, wheeling access charge, and the transmission access charge will be used to pay the subscriber wheeling charge first, as similar to what we do for all non-load serving participating TOs, and then the extra revenue goes into allocation for load serving entities to meet their transmission revenue requirements. So any additional thoughts or comments on that? All right.
Moving on. Questions?
Excellent. Moving on to the generator interconnection process. And this one, a number of stakeholders requested clarification on the specifics of exactly what steps is the ISO going to take with respect to the generator interconnection process and the transmission planning process. And then how does the SPTO project get into the base cases for both the generator interconnection process and the transmission planning process. And thank you very much for asking for that clarification. It really pointed out to us that while we understood what was going to happen, we obviously did not articulate it specifically enough for all of you to understand what was going to happen. So what's going to happen is that for any type of transmission interconnection, the requirement is, and this requirement has existed for forever, the transmission line that is trying to interconnect with other transmission lines has to go to the owner of that transmission line and request an interconnection study. So there's a system impact study and then a facility impact study, two studies that are done as part of the interconnection process for a transmission line interconnecting. And obviously, you know, if you're interconnecting a transmission line, either it's a transmission line that's hooked in with other transmission facilities, or it's got generation on the line, but whether it's hooked in or it has generation, in order for the entity that it's interconnecting with to be able to study that, the interconnecting transmission owner needs to know exactly how many megawatts are on that line, what are the interconnections, what are, you know, the impacts of everything, so that they can do the power flow analysis, the reliability assessment, and ultimately what ends up happening as part of this, the deliverability assessment as to what the requirements are going to be for the ISO balancing authority anyways, to achieve both reliability within our balancing authority area and deliverability. So the way that the subscriber PTO, so since all of that study is already done as part of the interconnection process, there's no reason for the subscriber PTO or the generator that's part of the subscriber PTO project to then have to redo the study again, because they've already done it, they've already paid the interconnecting participating transmission owner within the ISO balancing authority area, and any other interconnecting transmission owners. They've already paid for all those study costs. So there's no reason for them to pay for that again. So the specific steps that they're going to have to take is, one, they have to request to become a participating subscriber PTO, which is done through the transmission control agreement, requires certain application process. Once the ISO approves that application, we actually go to the board, get that approval. We'll have the applicant PTO agreement, which has already been executed by Transwest Express. That will be part of the filing that we're going to make with FERC for the SPTO model. So that will be a pro forma agreement, so that everybody's signing the same applicant participating TO agreement. They'll have to have, the generator will have to have executed the generator interconnection agreement, and they will have to have provided a notice to proceed to the ISO in order to get into the generator interconnection base case. And then as far as deliverability is concerned, to the extent that, as you know, I'm sure all of you are aware, the 2023-2024 CPUC resource portfolios specifically defined getting out-of-state wind from Wyoming and New Mexico into the ISO balancing authority area. So to the extent that CPUC portfolio specifically requires it, then in essence, the subscriber PTO will have the first option to acquire that deliverability. If the CPUC resource portfolio doesn't include a line that is trying to come in as a subscriber PTO, the line can still come in. They just will go through the deliverability process just like everybody else does, and they'll have to meet one of the various criteria associated with the transmission TPD deliverability application process. So that's how the generator is going to be studied. how the interconnection is going to be studied, and the different steps in order to get it into the generator interconnection base case. And let me just real quickly, Alan, I see that your hand has been raised, but let me just real quickly go to the next slide, which is the transmission planning process. And in the transmission planning process, as I've said, they've already been fully studied for their interconnection, including the generation portion of it. So the 3 steps, in essence, that I just went through are the 3 steps that are going to be required for them to be included in the transmission planning process base case. It'll be no different. I would say the only difference from a regular generator interconnecting to it is that the regular generator, once it's been identified in the study process, then the transmission upgrades are included in the TPP base case. They don't have to submit that notice to proceed, whereas for the subscriber PTO, we are requiring them to submit a notice to proceed. So with that, if you could, Michelle, open up the line for Alan Combs. Go ahead,
Hi,
Alan.
this is Alan Combs for New Consulting. I will have a couple questions about how this interfaces with the interconnection process. I think here when I read through, and I should say, my understanding is that although I know this is like now the final proposal, this is the first time we've seen the tariff language since, so this will be our first opportunity to comment on the tariff language. So looking at that, I don't really see where the generators that have signed IAs, it's not clear to me how the generators are being treated versus the subscriber. So like, will these entities that get interconnection agreements, will they have queue numbers? I guess that's a question. And then second, well, I am going to have questions about when transmission planning deliverability is made available to either the subscribers or other generators. But why don't I start there? I'm surprised there aren't more. There isn't more reflection of these generators on the subscriber lines being reflected in the queue. So.
Well, as we said in the final proposal, they will get a queue number. And the reason why we don't really need to change very much with respect to the TPD allocation process in Appendix DD is that they're going to, we did add that one section where to the extent that they are part of the resource portfolio, they'll have the first option for deliverability. That's in section 8.9, that addition is in there.
Yep.
But other than that, they're going to be treated the same as any other generator getting deliverability. So that's why we didn't have to make very many changes.
I do have questions about, well, they're like any other generator, but they're not, do they have the same retention criteria? Will they have to show performance and run the risk of losing deliverability? Let me ask that, because that does relate to what's in the IA.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah, all right. I'll have more questions when we get to the allocation process, but thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
There are no additional questions in the phone-only line or WebEx.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. All right, moving on to the next slide. So for the deliverability, the subscriber generator will apply for deliverability, as I just said, just like everyone else, through the TPD process. And as I just said, they'll have the first option for deliverability to the extent that The subscriber PTO line is included in the CPUC portfolio. They'll also have the same opportunities and will hold the TPD deliverability for them until the opportunities have been exhausted. So similar to a generator today, you get in for the first time around and they'll get their TPD deliverability if they're part of the CPUC portfolio, so they then probably wouldn't park their project. But to the extent that they aren't in the CPUC proposal, then they'll be able to park their project, and they can have 2 parking opportunities to get TPD deliverability, just like any other generator. And that's why we didn't need to make a bunch of changes to the Section DD. And as far as the market import capability is concerned, since they are bringing in transmission from outside of the ISO balancing authority area, we obviously are going to have new import points that will be added to the ISO. So with those new import points that are being added, there will be new maximum import capability at those new import points. The existing import points will have priority over future interconnections. So with respect to Transwest Express, the MIC that already exists at El Dorado and at Harry Allen will stay the same. That MIC will not change with the interconnection or the loop-in of the Transwest Express line. And just to remind everybody, MIC is allocated to load-serving entities, and it's the load-serving entities that get that maximum import capability. And since the subscriber is going to be within the ISO balancing authority area, their generator does not need MIC in order to deliver to the ISO load. So with that, Michelle, if you could open up the line for Virginia Thompson.
Deb, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. I just had a clarification question for bullet 1 when we talk about the TPD process and deliverability, the yearly affidavits for deliverability. If you are a subscriber generator on Transwest Express and you go through this process and thinking about the deliverability affidavits as they exist today, would you, in the absence of any changes, is the ISO going to consider the subscriber generators in bucket A automatically, or how would that work?
Virginia, this is Rudy. As Debbie was mentioning before, we did not change any of the application criteria or the retention criteria, so these subscriber generators are open to apply in whichever bucket they qualify for. If they have a PPA, apply in Group A. If you're shortlisted, apply for the applicable group. We're not pushing them into any group by default. All we're doing is really holding the deliverability, which is their first option, until they have exhausted all the parking chances they have in the TPD allocation process. But otherwise, everything else remains the same.
Okay, so you're still looking at those generators meeting the same milestone requirements as anybody else, and if they don't, then theoretically the deliverability could be given to another project that comes in the generation interconnection process that's further along in their milestone.
It will be released, right?
Right, it would be released similar to the way that deliverability is released today after the, I know we're in the middle of a night process, but with the existing tariff rules, you need to show that you have a PPA and you're moving forward. If you go past the 7 years, then you need to justify why you're taking so much longer than anticipated in order to come online.
Okay, understood. All right, so as long as I'm in the same, if I'm a subscriber generator, as long as I'm in the same TPD allocation group, I would have first priority as long as I've met the same milestones within that group. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
And Michelle, could you open up Alan's line again, please?
Yeah, thank you. Alan Combs with New Consulting. So, I mean, if you look at section, the TBD allocation process, and that's primarily in section 8.9 of Appendix DD, the way it's proposed is that the deliverability associated with the subscriber commitments would be taken off the top. I mean, it's going to be removed as a commitment of the transmission plan. So I don't understand how it then makes its way back to a generator. I mean, why isn't it just sort of made available, and then the generators that have now IAs and viability criteria, and maybe maybe they have their own group, as maybe you change your viability criteria. Why wouldn't they get it through group A, B, C, or D? Well, C is for maybe not C, but groups A, B, or D.
We just felt that the easiest way to implement it was to go ahead and put it in underneath section 8.9.1, a IC.
Yeah. Well, there's easy, but then there's, I think right or non-discriminatory. I'm just really, I'm really concerned about this actually. So, I mean, and I think we need a bit of a level set here. If you go to the transmission plan, and again, it was just 1 year's, but of the $5.5 billion of policy upgrades, 4.3 billion of those were associated with out-of-state wind. Now, granted, it provided more capability than what is required for out-of-state wind. But based on my judgment, I'd say a very significant fraction of those upgrades support the out-of-state wind, which is specifically as modeled in, just again, this is just last year's plan. It was plus 3,300 megawatts coming from Idaho and Wyoming, and plus 1,900 megawatts coming in from New Mexico through Palo Verde. So that's a lot of dollars of deliverability being reserved off the top. And so, I mean, I think there's first of all, I don't know if there's been adequate notice given to the Q generators, but second, there's just a transparency issue. I mean, does California realize how many resources they're committing to get this out-of-state wind in? Has that been communicated?
Well, it's being communicated through the CPUC IRP that comes up with the portfolio. It's being communicated as part of the transmission planning process, and the generator interconnection is just bringing that all to fruition. All
right. I'm okay. I mean, I just don't, in the end, I don't know how much, in the end, I don't know if it's very clear how much has been encumbered by this. But granted, it's part of an IRP. I'm not going to argue with that. But let's go to, first of all, I think there's a question of when is an approved upgrade made available in the TP allocation process? If you look at the Appendix DD, it's pretty clear about that they remove things that are obligations, but they don't really say when an approved upgrade shows up as TP deliverability. So I'm assuming, but I don't know, but can you confirm whether the I mean, the CAISO in its transmission plan identified 11 upgrades as being required to support out-of-state wind in reflection of the policy upgrades. Were those upgrades made available for generators that were seeking deliverability this year?
No, because those upgrades are for the out-of-state wind.
Right.
All right, but let me ask, so next year, let's say, well, first of all, the tariff doesn't, I'm not sure the tariff says that today, but let's say next year occurs and a subscriber hasn't signed its enabling agreements, are you going to hold it? Are you going to hold the TP back again, even though the subscriber maybe hasn't, the subscriber PTO hasn't signed its agreements?
Unless, I mean, that's in the criteria that we identified below. If they haven't met the criteria to actually apply, we cannot hold it for them. But
nowhere does it identify
which
transmission, how much of each transmission plan upgrade it would be held back for this out-of-state wind. Because when you look at the transmission plan, it just shows an increment of out-of-state wind. You can see it from the basin sensitivity, or you can just see, but nor do you see, well, how much is actually really going to be held back? And I think there's going to be some judgment. I mean, I haven't even started to talk about effectiveness factors. You could have perhaps 1,000 megawatts of generators trying to interconnect at, say, at Devers that wouldn't get deliverability because you held back an upgrade to increase transfer capability out of Palo Verde / Colorado River, right? And I think the market needs to know that. They'll see the transmission plan, but nowhere is it going to be said, well, until these PTO, these subscriber PTOs sign, we're going to hold back all this deliverability. And in all the press releases, I know it was the support out-of-state wind, but I don't think they said of the $5.5 billion, actually, 80% of it was actually to support out-of-state generation, right? I don't know if that quite was communicated. So, but to get to a specific question here, as of right now, there's no, other than it just won't be made available, and you just won't, there's nothing communicated in advance how much will be made available for generators that are trying to get it through Group A, B, or D?
Well, the deliverability associated with the subscriber PTO line, if it's in the CPUC portfolio, we will hold that quantity for the project.
Right. Well, where is that quantity shown? I'm just saying, is that quantity shown anywhere?
I believe that quantity is in the transmission plan, but to tell you the truth, I did not read the transmission plan this year.
I don't know how to find it. I mean, I can kind of divine it, or estimate it, but. All right. Well, we'll follow up with a question of that. Well, I'll put my hand down for now, but I might have one more question before we're over. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Yeah, the other question was about process. So this is the first time I've ever seen significant changes like this to tariff Appendix DD is called the generator interconnection and deliverability allocation process. And you are very much in this proposal augmenting the deliverability allocation process. So I'm just confused why this wasn't proposed in IPE. I mean, is there no market notice going to go out to all interconnected generators to tell them that 80% of the upgrades they saw in last year's transmission plan are going to be held back for 1 or 3 subscriber PTOs?
Well, this whole discussion has been going on since August of last year, and every one of the papers has included a discussion regarding deliverability. So I don't know what additional...
Well, this is the first time I've seen how it works. So so it sounds like the answer is no, it hasn't really been communicated through IPE. And I think you earlier said that you thought you could do this without as much tariff changes. So you're very much, showing that you require a change to the deliverability allocation process. So, all right, that was my last point. Thank you.
Okay. And Alan, just so you know, that change was made back in February. So there have been 4 papers since then outlining that it's going to be done in the tariff, and the deliverability is part of the components of the project.
Yeah, but it could have, well, I'm sorry. Well, maybe you don't have to do it by taking it off the top. You could just, you've already assigned generators on the subscriber line queue numbers. You make them sign interconnection agreements. They could go through, they could be in a non-discriminatory manner vying for transmission. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure the PUC has fully internalized or socialized the fact that Edison is going to provide 4.3, some fraction of $4.3 billion of upgrades to support out-of-state wind transfer capability to load. That's all. I'm not sure that has been communicated back to IRP, but I'll look into that. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, can you open up the line for Hillary, please? Go ahead, Hillary.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. This is Hillary Hebert with HMH Energy Consulting. I have a question, but just also wanted to agree a bit with what Alan was just saying about this issue being a little bit buried. And from my perspective, the way I see it is that in the IPE proceeding, one of the initial, and I know you're probably not following that proceeding, but one of the initial issue papers or scoping papers, they had teed up this issue of whether transmission capacity should be held back for resources that are specifically identified in the IRP. And in future iterations of that initiative's papers, that issue was dropped. But there wasn't really a notice or we weren't really told like, oh, well, that's being picked up in this other proceeding. So I just happened to kind of poke my head into this proceeding during the last call to see what was going on, but I did not expect it to cover this topic. So just from a stakeholder perspective, I do agree it's been a little bit hard to follow the dots on this particular part of the subscriber PTO topic. But I did have a question, just maybe a clarification of the question that Ms. Thompson asked earlier. She was asking, just sounded like she was trying to clarify what we're all trying to clarify, which is our existing deliverability applicants getting bumped in some way, and I think she asked, do the subscriber PTO generators get, do they get put into the same buckets that everybody else does for deliverability? And I think your answer, I'm just trying to clarify, make sure I understood right. I think your answer was yes, the subscriber PTO generators are treated just like everyone else in that, they get put in the bucket that they qualify for. But isn't that if they aren't part of subscriber PTO line that was included in the IRP portfolio? So in other words, yes, they get put in the buckets that everyone else does, unless they get a right of first refusal based on being identified in the IRP. Just wanted to make that clarification.
I think because we are holding deliverability specifically for these subscriber generators, we are separating them from the other queue generators because we're not encroaching on their deliverability. But all we're saying is in order for them to utilize their first option, they still have to meet some performance criteria.
Right.
Because one of the concerns from stakeholders was, are you going to hold this for what, 5 years and 10 years? There has to be some boundaries, and this is us drawing those boundaries. Just from a procedural standpoint, right? Like if we all agree there should be deliverability held, this is how it should be held.
Right. I think, yeah. understood. So it sounds like, for the projects that are in the right of first refusal bucket, they still have to make some milestone progress. I mean, they can't just sit there.
Correct.
That's good. But I
Correct.
just wanted to make sure I understood that they are in their own separate bucket to begin with. I mean, they're not just waiting. They're not classified along with all of the other CAISO generators in buckets A, B, C. They're in their own separate bucket to begin with.
Yeah, you could look at it as they start out in their own separate bucket, but they do still have the retention obligations that all the other generators have.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that correctly.
Okay, you're welcome. Michelle, can you open up Doug Boccionioni's line? Go ahead.
For the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. We were part of the joint commenters that asked some questions about deliverability, and I did not see responses to our questions. And in particular, we're wondering that, once the SPTO facility is part of the ISO grid, and you are assessing deliverability for the generators that are interconnecting to it, how will these be treated? Are you going to apply the same criteria you apply for any other generators that are on the ISO grid in terms of the N-1 and N-2 common mode outages that you consider?
Yeah, the deliverability allocations and the functionality is the same as what transmission planning does for today.
So the reason we asked the question is it seems like the way this project is configured, there's a direct current line component that then if that line goes out, the resources won't pass the deliverability test. And if any portion of the AC line is on the common tower, it's not going to pass the N-2 portion of the test. So are we setting ourselves up for, building these, paying the facilities being built, paid for by somebody else, but then the resources that use that facility, how are they going to get deliverability? Are we going to have to pay for another version of the project to make it deliverable?
They're getting deliverability at the point of injection into the existing grid. So that's at Harry Allen. We're not studying deliverability on the lines they're building.
So even though that line becomes part of the ISO grid, it's like a different kind of ISO grid facility where you don't apply the same test. You'll only apply the deliverability test on the rest of the ISO grid facilities.
Yeah, I think the deliverability was at the point of injection to the current grid. So I think, to your point, our understanding is we are not doing a deliverability study on that line. It is doing a deliverability study at the point that line is injecting into the broader.
Okay, great. That's helpful. But so now what if a non-subscriber wants to connect to that line and they want deliverability? Are we
I don't know the answer to these questions.
Yeah, I think that takes us to a different route.
Well, I know, but the final proposal says if upgrades are required in the future, then that'll be borne by the ISO loads. And I think what we're setting ourselves up for is to have to build another parallel facility to make those resources deliverable.
Well,
just like we would if they connected to the existing ISO grid.
Well, I guess I'm a little confused, Doug. As an example, we've got generation over at Palo Verde, and we've got generation that's connecting at Delaney. there's not a duplicate path from Delaney to Colorado River. There's not a duplicate path. You know, originally, we had generation out at Four Corners, and there's not a duplicate path for that. So I guess I'm confused as to what
Well, I think for the ones that are connecting from outside the ISO grid, you treat them as an import facility, right?
No,
So
all of those are inside the ISO grid. Delaney is inside the ISO grid. Palo Verde is inside the ISO grid.
So I mean, maybe it works because of the way you draw the bubbles for the zones, or is it because you allow for RAS schemes to be applied? I'm not expecting you to answer. I'm just saying that these are the kind of questions that sort of we thought of, and that's why we asked the questions in our comments, and we didn't see a response.
Okay, I thought.
And just to emphasize, we're very supportive of the SPTO concept, but we just want to be sure we're aware of all the ramifications.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, Michelle, next slide. All right, so just a summary of the ISO final proposal for the SPTO. The subscriber generator, in essence, will have encumbrance rights on the system. The non-subscribers will be charged the load will be charged the TAC, exports will be charged the wheeling access charge. They'll, in essence, pay, the subscriber PTO will be paid the non-subscriber rate, which will be capped at the TAC or the WAC. The original build for the subscriber PTO facility itself will not be included in the ISO transmission revenue requirement, whereas the costs associated with upgrades on existing systems will be included in the transmission revenue requirement for the existing PTOs. Once the subscriber encumbrance is terminated, it will be up to the regulatory rights at that point in time as to what happens. But if the subscriber encumbrance ends early, the subscriber PTO cannot include the original build cost into the ISO TRR. And the subscriber PTO will be studied as part of the transmission interconnection process. Next slide, please. For future interconnections, they'll be treated in accordance with the ISO tariff, and the subscriber PTO will have to develop a cost of service transmission revenue requirement. The MIC will be allocated to the new scheduling points that the subscriber PTO brings into the system. The current MIC allocation will retain its priority over the new MIC allocations. The subscriber PTO, in order to get into the base case for the GIT-app and for the transmission planning process, will have to execute the applicant participating TO agreement, have to have the generator execute the generator interconnection agreement, and provide a commitment to build the project to the ISO. And once all that's done, it'll be the generation and the transmission interconnections will be incorporated in both the TPP and the GIT-app base cases. And then the subscriber PTO will be given the first option to acquire the deliverability if the project is a project that has been included in the CPUC resource portfolio requirements. Next slide, please. So today concludes the discussion on the final proposal. We do plan on taking it to the Board of Governors at their July 20th board meeting. The draft tariff language was published at the same time as when we published the draft final proposal. We're looking for comments on that by July 19th. And once we get those comments and get a chance to review them, we'll have a separate stakeholder meeting, probably in the August timeframe, a date to be determined to go through any changes that are incorporated based on comments received from stakeholders on the tariff language. So before I turn it back to Caitlin, it looks like Ryan has a question. Michelle, could you unmute his line? Go ahead, Ryan.
Hi, Deb. Can you hear me?
Your line's unmuted. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yep.
Sorry, there's a delay there. Just curious if you have a FERC filing target date. I know there's a stakeholder meeting you're talking about in August. Do you have an idea of when you would shoot for filing at FERC?
We're trying to file this as soon as possible so that we can go ahead and get the FERC decision, realizing that legal is a little stretched at the moment, working on DAME and EDAM. So we have to sequence in with that. So we don't have a specific target at this time.
Okay, but conceivably before the end of the year?
Oh, definitely before the end of the year.
Okay. Thanks.
We're looking for an order before the end of the year, or I'm looking for an order. I'm looking for an order before the end of the year. I'm not sure what legal's looking for, but that's what I'm looking for.
And then just to refresh my memory, because it's been a while, and it's 60 days from that filing date that you'd expect to hear from FERC, right?
Correct. It's a 206 filing.
Thank you.
Certainly. Michelle, could you open Virginia's line again? Go ahead, Virginia.
I just had a quick clarification question, and I apologize, I was a little distracted. I remember you saying something about the end of the life of the project, and you joked about maybe not being around at that point in time. Can you just review what you were saying happens, or what the point of that that statement was? Was it talking about recovery or tax?
Yes, the question that was included as part of the proposal is what happens if the subscriber encumbrance goes away and the transmission line hasn't been fully paid for. And so we incorporated as part of the proposal that if the encumbrance goes away, that's the subscriber PTO's problem. They still have to pay for the remaining costs of their transmission line. They cannot include it as a TRR in the ISO's access charge. And as far as encumbrances are concerned, whether those get to be continued, after the encumbrance is over, would be subject to whatever regulatory requirements exist at that point in time. I mean, who knows what's going to exist 30 or 40 years down the road.
Right. Okay. All right. That's what I thought that it was relative to, but thanks for warning.
No problem. All right. Not seeing any other questions. Caitlin, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you. Michelle, we can move to the next slide, please. So this concludes our stakeholder call for today. We do ask that you please submit comments on the draft tariff language using the commenting tool on the initiative webpage by the end of day July 19th. That commenting template should be available this afternoon, no later than tomorrow, definitely. And you can access the commenting tool using that link to the initiative webpage, that second bullet point there. And if you have any questions or need help accessing the commenting tool, you can email ISO@CaISO.com. So thank you again for your participation today, and thank you, Deb, for your presentation. Have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.